Hi, I'm Dan Galpin, and with me is Bruno Oliveira and Todd Kerpelman. And today we're going to be talking about the top 7 developer mistakes people make in setting up Google Play services.
So our show today is going to be entirely about mistakes.
Your mistakes.
Exactly.
So before we start talking about your mistakes, let's do a little summary of what Google Play game services actually are. So this, of course, is Google's backend to do achievements and leaderboards, real-time multiplayer, cloud save, as well as some anti-piracy features that are on Android to help you, game developers, implement best-of-breed services scaling to Google scale.
Exactly, and I think especially with real-time multiplayer, I mean, this is one big piece of infrastructure that we are taking into our own hands, so that you can actually focus on what make your games awesome.
Yeah, and instead of writing all that boring infrastructure code,
exactly.
Let us write the boring code, and you
we
guys.
We like boring stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we like thinking about scale, and you guys can think about fun, and I think that's a good way of dividing things up.
Exactly. So with that, let's dive into our list of top 7 developer mistakes. So first of all, let's talk about using the jar file instead of the library project. So as you know, when you're using Google Play Game Services, you have to include the Google Play Services library project. And then if you're using our samples, you have to include the base game utils library project. The mistake that some developers do is thinking that library projects are actually don't mean anything and they can just include the jar files. Well, jar files are just classes, and while library projects are something that wraps classes and resources into the same bundle. So the worst thing is that they won't really notice if they make this mistake.
Yeah, we don't actually go and validate the APK to make sure the resources are there that you're actually referencing when you're doing one of these projects. So that jar file actually contains references to resources that we're providing in that library project. And if you don't put those resources in, there's nothing in the compiler, there's nothing in the dexer, there's nothing in the packager that's actually going to catch that mistake. Who's going to catch that mistake? Your users are going to catch that mistake.
Exactly. And you might not even catch it during testing because you're the only place where you're going to see this mistake is if the library actually wants to use a resource from that bundle. And that's going to happen, for example, when the user can't sign in and it has to show a dialog box. So ironically enough, when the library is trying to show an error message, then it's going to figure out that it doesn't have that resource, and then it's going to have to show an error message saying that it can't show the error message. And it's going to look something like that. I mean, that's everyone's favorite screen, right?
Absolutely. And the best part is it's not a crash in our code. It looks like a crash in your code. It's
going to totally look like it's your fault. And that's
or your mistake.
Or your mistake.
So there's mistake number 7.
Exactly.
So I think we should take it over to Todd Kerpelman, who is in Studio I. And Todd, are you there?
Hi, I'm here. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting a little tape delay. It's kind of I'm kind of far away. Yeah. So but I'll try and stay current.
And now we're going to use our confidential teleporting technology to pass this laptop all the way over to Studio I.
All right, thanks.
There we go. Oh, that worked.
Fabulous.
Is it the same laptop?
It is, in fact, the same laptop.
That's our Pixelanti at work here.
There you go. This is a pretty laptop. That wasn't product plug. It really is a nice laptop.
It is. It's beautiful.
It is.
All right.
So our next mistake is using the Google APIs console instead of the Google Play Developer Console. And let's explain why this matters and why you care. So on the back end, we've got a set of game services, right? And we also have on our back end a whole bunch of other API-related stuff.
And that's a technical term.
That's a technical term. That's what we call it, API stuff. So the other API stuff is generally set up using the Google API's Developer Console. If you have added any Google services in the past, generally on the web, but certainly other devices, you may have seen this Developer Console. It's at code.google.com/API/console. Game services is generally set up. Oh, sorry, and yes. This is generally where you would set up your OAuth 2.0 client IDs. You could review your quotas. You could add other team members to your project, and so on. The game services are generally set up and administered through the Google Play Developer Console. This is the developer console that you would be used to visiting if you're an Android developer. But iOS and web guys, you're going to have to go here too. At the game services console, this is where you would set up your leaderboards, your achievements, and then also where you would associate these leaderboards and achievements with the OAuth 2.0 client IDs that you set up. So how does this work? In general, the Game Services Developer Console manages all of this for you. I visit the Developer Console, and I would say I want to link an application. I'm going to link an iOS application or an Android application or a web application. When I do that, the Play Developer Console automatically sets up an OAuth 2.0 client ID for me. I don't need to go and visit the Google APIs console. When it sets up that client ID, it also sets up an association to that client ID, so that when I log in using that client ID, the service knows, okay, this is associated with the leaderboards and achievements that the developer has created. If I were to go and visit the Google APIs console, because maybe I'm a web developer and this is what I've done in the past and I know all about creating client IDs, I'll be able to create an OAuth 2.0 client ID, but on the game services side, it has no idea that I've gone and done this. And so when a user signs in to this client ID, they're basically, the system is going to get confused and say, well, it looks like a valid login, but I have no idea what set of achievements this goes with. And you'll run into probably some funky and hard to diagnose errors, which are my favorite. There is one exception to this rule, which is if you have created any Google APIs for your game in the past, when you create a new project, a brand new project on the Google Play Developer Console, it will give you a chance to say, hey, I've already created, some services, maybe I've, using Drive or something, with this game. And during creation time, it will give you a moment to sort of specify that project, and it will go and sort of, create some associations during project creation time. But this is the only time that works. If after I create this project, I can then go and visit the Google APIs console and create another client ID, I'm going to cause confusion. So kind of a confusing subject, particularly because at some point you may actually need to go and visit the Google APIs console to do sort of some weird tweaky things, like maybe you need to change your OAuth redirect or something. So it does get confusing. But as a general rule, when at all possible, do everything from the Google Play Developer Console and forget that old one exists.
Yeah, it was our opportunity to make things easier, allow you to do everything all in one interface, and I think for some people it actually made things more confusing. And one thing it's important to know is just understanding how OAuth works is a little bit helpful in understanding why you have to do some of the things you have to do in setting up your game for Play Game Services.
Yeah, but it's important to notice that if the same feature is available through the APIs console and the developer console, you should always prefer to do it from the developer console.
Absolutely.
Because that's going to set up your game in the right way to use our API.
It also doesn't help that we call the developer console the developer console.
And
it sounds very
console,
generic.
the API console.
Yeah, really we should be calling it the games console or something.
Exactly. We got to have some slick name for it,
Yes.
like we have for this laptop.
We'll work on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So our next common mistake that developers run into is getting throttled.
That sounds painful.
It is very painful. So here's the issue, right? When you set up your service, you'll probably notice if you go and visit the Google APIs console, which you generally probably shouldn't because we just talked about that. You might notice that your quota is set to like some incredibly high QPD quota per day. However, and so you'll get, hey, look, you've got 80 gazillion calls you can make a day, and developers like, great, I'm going to make calls all the time. However, we do throttle similar calls to a few per minute. So calls of the exact same type will get throttled. What does this mean? Well, if you're incrementing 4 different achievements at once, that's actually okay. We have sort of different limits for that, and in general, as long as you're sort of acting reasonable there, you're okay. However, if you were to try and increment the same achievement, say 4 times in 10 seconds or 10 times a minute, that's bad, and that would probably cause about half of your calls to fail. What's even more interesting is half of your calls will fail, but if you were to go and look up your quota, it would still say, oh, you're using 0 or 1% of your quota, because that's really talking about your 80 gazillion calls per day and not mentioning the fact that half of your calls are getting throttled. The only way you'd actually know you're getting throttled is to sort of look for error messages that get returned by the service and make a note of those or log those or something like that.
What if I have a game that it's a game where I have to kill enemies, and then I have an incremental achievement which is to kill 10 gazillion enemies, and then how do I do that?
Because that is a very good question, and that actually brings us to our next slide. Hey, look at that. Wow, it's almost like you knew what my presentation was going to be about.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So we've got our incremental achievement. That's kill 5,000 enemies. So the wrong way to do it, the bad way to do it, would be to make an achievement.increment call every time the player shoots an enemy. Let's assume this happens pretty often, and I'm shooting enemies left and right. You don't want to be making that increment call all the time. The best way to do it would be wait until the end of a round, or wait until a few seconds have passed, or something like that, and then make an increment call based on the number of enemies I've killed, up to that point. So at the end of a round, it says, oh look, you've killed 38 enemies. Then I can submit that increment call. Another mistake I've seen some developers make is constantly submitting high scores. If you're playing a game and throughout the game my score keeps getting higher and higher, you don't want to be calling, hey, submit new high score every time my score goes up, right? Wait until the end of the game and then make that one call. It is true that I suppose if my game crashes halfway through, I won't get a chance to submit that partial high score. But in general, I think you're better off just wait until the end of the round, submit that final high score.
If you're writing a game and you don't expect the game to last for 5 minutes, I mean, you're pretty much in trouble, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say don't code around the fact that you expect your game to crash regularly.
Exactly.
Yeah, I suppose you'd be better off just make sure your game doesn't crash.
Exactly.
And at some point, just to be clear, at some point we actually hope to make it easier. We actually hope to do some of this, packaging up of multiple increment achievement calls so that you don't have to.
It looks like there's room for improvement on our side there.
There's room for improvement on our side. We definitely could do a better job, both in terms of sort of the library helping to mitigate this, as well as letting developers know that their calls are being throttled. Right now, it's unless you're analyzing the responses that come back, it's pretty hard for you as a developer to know.
Yeah. Oh yeah, one thing to remember is definitely make sure to submit the high score when you get an on-stop though, because when you get an on-stop, it might be that your application is going to be killed.
Exactly.
So in that case, you definitely do want to make a call.
Yeah, you really want to honor the life cycle, whenever possible, and all of these things, avoid data loss. But don't just keep incrementing the high score every time you kill the next alien, because that's just going to be ridiculous, and our servers are going to say down on that.
Right. By the way, one other issue I've seen rarely was an issue where a developer was constantly checking achievements. I believe this was sort of as a weird way of making sure they were submitting the right number of incremental achievements, as they were constantly pinging our server to be like, how much achievement progress have you made so far? Okay, now they have this number. Now I know the exact right amount to increment. I think this was kind of a bug that they forgot to cache this data or something like that. But
well, the thing
again, reads can be, if you're calling the same read multiple times, that can be just as bad as a write.
Yeah, the thing I love about working with platforms is that you really find incredibly creative ways that people tend to misuse your APIs. So even though this may look like our mistake, this is actually your mistake. So do try to avoid doing these things.
We're sounding a little defensive. Maybe we should just let's move on.
Well, this is a show about this is a show about mistakes. We're making plenty of mistakes. So mistake one, we're acting too defensive.
All
okay,
right.
all right.
Let's make a note of our mistakes
during the show about mistakes.
All right, so on to the next mistake, if you will. It's number 4, publishing an APK but not the game services, or vice versa. So this may be a little counterintuitive, but an application and the game settings are things that are linked, but they also exist separately. So you might actually be able to publish one without the other. So you might, if you just publish your app, what's going to happen is that you're going to have a game that's published, but your game settings are not, which means that anytime anybody tries to use a game API from your game, you're going to get this weird error because the game settings are not published. You might not see the error because you probably listed yourself as a trusted tester on your own game, so you're going to be able to use the game's API. But then whenever anybody else tries to use that, they're going to get an error. So it's important to make sure that both are published. The other situation is also possible. You might just end up publishing the game settings, but then forgetting to publish the app.
But then people won't see that in Google Play.
Exactly. It's less serious than the other scenario, but it's also possible. So you will definitely want to make sure that if you're publishing your game, you want to publish both the app and the game settings. So just taking a look at what the screens look like. So this on this screen, you're publishing the game settings. So this is the game settings screen. And you have this publish game item over there. So that's publishing the game settings. Now, this other screen is where you publish the actual app. So notice that you are in store listing, and then you have the publish app option over there, and that causes the actual app to be published. So you want to make sure to do both steps to make sure that your game can be used outside of your company.
Exactly. And people may ask, well, why do you even bother doing this? And, and the reality is when you look at the game lifecycle, you're actually going to be wanting to do things like add achievements that your trusted testers can see before your actual end users can see it. So in order to do that, we actually allow you to create those achievements. Your trusted testers can see them immediately. And then once you actually publish the game services with the game data, then your real users will be able to see it.
Exactly. Suppose, for instance, you have an existing game on Google Play, and then you just want to like start working on the game services, but without publishing it. So it makes sense to have the app published, but not the game settings. And then when you're ready to launch the game services, then you do that. Okay, next common mistake is signing in with an account that isn't a tester.
Oh.
Yeah, so this kind of brings us, this is related to what we were talking about before. If you have a set of achievements or leaderboards that have not been published, they're only available to users that are listed as testers. Now that means that you need to go here in this little testing section of the Google Play Developer Console and confirm that the account you're testing with is in fact listed here among the test accounts. Basically, if if this doesn't happen, you'll get sort of mysterious errors where it'll sort of be like, yeah, I'm logged in, but I don't see any game services. I don't know what you're talking about. These achievements don't exist.
This game doesn't exist. Is what it actually like. You'll actually end up getting back like 404 looking like errors.
It's going to pretend that it doesn't know anything about your game. Like your game, never heard of it.
Which I mean is sort of correct, right? Yeah. Like you don't want random people to try and like
and
submit achievements and probe your game. And so if your set of services, your achievements, your leaderboards are in a testable but not published state, they can only be accessed by accounts that you've listed here as testers.
And notice that even the developer who published the game settings is not automatically a tester unless they have an account on Google+. So if your developer account doesn't have an account on Google+, you have to also list yourself as a tester. So just a general rule, just list yourself as a tester because that prevents those corner cases.
Yep. Basically, always go to that tester tab. Make sure that all the accounts that you're actually planning on testing with are listed there, because chances are, some of them might not be.
Yeah, and that is an important corner case, though, to note that if your publisher account is not Plus enabled, then you will, and you try to use it, bad things will happen. So
exactly.
So do note that.
Yes.
All right. Next is another common mistake is to mistake your client ID for your app ID in Android. So this is a pretty common one, and it doesn't help that the developer console gives you the client ID. Because the client ID is what you need for web and is what you need for iOS. But for Android, it's different. So if you look at an Android manifest file, you're going to see that metadata tag that points to a resource file. And that resource file has your app ID. So the app ID that you want to make sure is there is this numerical portion of your client ID. So this is only digits. It is a mistake to use the .apps.googleusercontent.com there. You only want the numbers in there. So that's a pretty common mistake.
And the other thing to note about this is there's a reason we put it into a string resource. And you think, oh, well, I can just take that number and I can paste it right into the metadata that's in the manifest. And it won't work because
it needs to be a string.
Because it needs to be a string. And if the XML parser sees a number in there, it'll actually turn it into an integer.
Very helpfully.
Very helpfully. And then our services will say, wait, it's not a string, and will do bad things. So leave it as a string. And some people are like, well, I have to make resources for this, but you do. Yeah. And this is just part of using it, and it'll make everything really happy.
Plus, it's much more organized to have this as a separate resource rather than having it hard-coded into your Android manifest.
Exactly.
It just looks better.
Yeah, right, absolutely. Because people looking at the manifest can tell that's the app ID instead of looking at the manifest data, which also says that it's the app ID.
Exactly.
Okay, so.
And so onto the last mistake that we're going to cover. Certainly not the last mistake that we're going to make. But
there's several at least I've already made in this presentation.
So it's using the wrong certificate in Android. So this is actually a kind of a deep topic. So it's useful to have something of an understanding of how these things actually work. So on your device you have your game. So like any Android app, your game has a package name. So let's suppose it's com.example.yourgame very creatively. I'm excellent at creating packages.
It won't let you publish that package name.
So you won't.
Yeah, but this is just an example. Okay,
exactly.
Don't use this.
Exactly. And then your game is, of course, signed by a certain certificate. So let's just assume that that's the certificate you're signing with.
Very short one.
Very short one. And then, of course, when you try to make a game's API call, what's going to happen is that the server is going to see if this game is actually authorized to make games API calls. And the way it does that is it's going to check your list of linked apps in the developer console. So in order for the call to be authenticated, there needs to be a linked app that exactly matches that package name and certificate fingerprint in the developer console. So over here, we see that there's a match because there's a linked app with exactly that package name and exactly that certificate fingerprint. So the Games API call is going to succeed. Now, if there isn't such a thing, then you're going to see an error. So this is the most common, by far the most common cause of errors. So to make sure that you're setting this up right, when you add a linked app, you see this screen. And then you go save and continue. And then the next step is authorizing your app. And then when you click on Authorize Your App Now, you're going to see this dialog box. So in this dialog box, you have to fill in your package name and the certificate fingerprint. Now, this is the step where many people make a mistake. So you have to take your certificate fingerprint from your release certificate that you have on your machine. You see, there is this example there. So this is not an example that you should use. This is just it's just there to show you what it should look like.
That's why it has example next to it.
Exactly, it's an example.
But unfortunately, is that a lot of people, will just take that, paste that right in. And what we should do is we should catch that. We should say, hey, don't use the example string.
Use the example. Yeah, but then what happens if their certificate is actually identical to the example?
That's true. It's unlikely, but possible.
Unlikely, but possible.
Yeah.
Also, you may notice that if you have an APK that's already published, maybe there's going to be a certificate suggestion over here. But then you should always make sure, don't trust that, and make sure that you're checking that your certificate is actually that one.
Yeah, if that suggestion is wrong, that's our mistake.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, but and if you publish it, people are going to be confused and not going to be able to log in.
Exactly. So it's always worth checking out if it's right. And to do that, you can use the key to command line tool. Essentially, to get your debug certificate fingerprint, this is the command line. You just go key to export cert, and the alias option is the name of your certificate, which for your debug certificate is going to be Android debug key. And then this is the key store file, which is usually in .android.debug.keystore. So this is how you get your debug certificate's fingerprint. And then, of course, you should also get your release certificate's fingerprint, which you can do using this command line. So in this case, you're going to have to replace your key name over there and then give the path to your key store. Once you have those two fingerprints, what we recommend is that you have two different client IDs in the same project, okay, with the same package name. But those two different client IDs, one of them has your debug certificate fingerprint, and the other one has your release certificate fingerprint. And they exist side by side. And what this means is that you can either sign into your game using your debug certificate or using your release certificate.
And this, because we only allow a limited number of client IDs for each game, you should consider using that debug certificate in for all of your development devices.
Exactly.
And for all of your developers, because otherwise, if you're going to run out of those client IDs very, very quickly.
Yeah. Oh, and also if you delete client IDs, remember that it takes a really long time for them to actually go away. Because after you delete them, it takes like almost a week until they actually disappear.
Yeah, so this causes a lot of confusion, and the mistake on our side is that we don't make it really clear enough that if you delete, the delete doesn't quite automatically happen. Yeah. So the best thing to do is never delete client IDs.
Yes. Always create one with your debug certificate, one with your release certificate, and then hopefully you're never going to have to touch those again.
So as the non-Android guy in the group, why do you need two certificates in the first place? Why can't I just use my release certificate everywhere?
You could, but then this means that during debugging, you would always have to sign your app with the release keys. And for some companies, especially for large companies, they want to keep their release keys certificates in a very secure way. So only certain people have access to it. This is to prevent somebody from grabbing a signed APK and uploading it into Google Play. So you might want to safeguard your release certificate and then only work with the debug certificate during debugging. And then only at the last step, when you're actually going to launch, you sign it with your release certificate.
And it's very, very easy to take that debug key store and simply copy it into every single one of your developers' machines.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
just use it there.
Yeah, it's just copying a file.
Exactly. And so that's that's definitely what we recommend. And also really do safeguard your release certificate because it's really, really important that you never lose it. So that's a non-gameplay services kind of developer mistake, but it's a really, really bad mistake.
Yep.
So.
Exactly. And also, we recommend that you take a look at our documentation. We have all of our API calls, we have the concepts, and we also have a step-by-step troubleshooting guide. So when things go wrong, you can go into that troubleshooting guide and then go step by step, and then hopefully that's going to help you figure out what went wrong.
And we're not just saying that because Bruno and Todd wrote large chunks of that. It actually is really helpful, and you really want to make sure that when you put a game out there, you're not ending up getting bad reviews and confused users because of simple mistakes that you could have corrected earlier on. So, and we're going to, of course, as we see more things that happen, we're going to try to make the documentation better and better, and
the whole UI better and better, just to make sure that those mistakes are more difficult to make.
Exactly, because ultimately these mistakes are a result of people not understanding how to implement our code and our examples. So
exactly.
we really do want to make sure that the word gets out there and that things go very smoothly. We've seen a lot of really excellent implementations already in the market, and so we want to keep the implementations really high quality and keep the user experience high quality.
So what should developers do if they have questions?
So if they have questions, it really depends on what platform you're developing on. You can always look at the Android tag and then look up games or play game services as well when you're on Stack Overflow. And we actually regularly look at these things.
Yep.
And
I usually search for the Android tag and then anything that has to do with games, and then I just look at the newest questions there.
Gotcha.
And are you doing a similar thing on iOS?
I do, yeah, on iOS, it's hard to look for iOS in games because there tends to be a lot of stuff that isn't Google material. So I generally look for the Google Play Game Services tag. I've seen that start to be used fairly often, and just look for anything that doesn't include Android, which tends to be a little less than the Android stuff.
And as always, of course, make sure to ask high-quality questions. So include very specific details about what your setup looks like, what are the error messages that you're seeing. If possible, include logcat and everything that might make your question easier to understand and debug.
Yeah, and there's instructions also in the game services on how to turn on logging.
Exactly.
And that'll help a lot because otherwise we won't see anything at all. In terms of errors coming through logcat. So you at least want to turn on logging when you are submitting questions to Stack Overflow.
Yep, and I guess that's pretty much.
I think that's it. So I hope you've enjoyed watching our mistakes, and we hope that this helps prevent you from making the same kind of mistakes that a bunch of other game developers have made. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.